want to start with a number, not a date this time, a ratio. In 1880, the United States Census recorded approximately 1.2 million children living in institutional care. Orphanages, foundling hospitals, industrial schools, reform institutions, state asylums with dedicated juvenile wards. 1.2 million children removed from family structures and placed inside systems that the public record describes, uniformly and without apparent irony, as protective. That number has never been adequately explained, not in terms of the demographics, not in terms of the mortality rates of the preceding decades, not in terms of the economic disruptions that the standard historical account offers as justification. Because when you run the math, when you look at the birth records and the death records and the census data from the preceding generation and try to construct a population model that produces 1.2 million institutionalized children in 1880, the numbers do not close. The orphan population of 1880 is too large for the parent mortality that the official record documents. There are more children without origins than there are documented origins to account for them. That gap between the children and the origins the record provides for them, that is where this investigation begins. Before I go further, I need to connect this to what we have already established in this series. We have documented, carefully, provisionally, with every appropriate qualification, that the early 19th century experienced a civilizational rupture of a scale that the mainstream historical account has never fully absorbed. The atmospheric catastrophe of 1816, the architectural anomalies, the cities without construction records, the bones that entered institutional possession and ceased to exist in any public catalogue, the asylum admissions that described individuals whose physical scale fell outside the parameters of the built environment designed to contain them. We have established that something ended, and something new was built on top of it, not gradually, not organically, with a speed and a completeness that the official story of 19th century development cannot account for without the kind of foundational assumptions it has never been willing to make publicly. But there is a dimension of that rupture that this series has not yet addressed directly. Because we have been looking at the physical evidence, the architecture, the bones, the geological record, the institutional documentation of adults whose existence created problems for the official narrative, we have not yet looked at what happened to the children. And I think that is where the most important part of this story has been hiding. Let me tell you about the orphan trains. The official history of the orphan trains is well documented and in many respects genuinely remarkable. Between 1854 and 1929, an organisation called the Children's Aid Society, founded by a man named Charles Loring Brace, transported approximately 250,000 children from the cities of the eastern United States to rural communities across the Midwest and the West. The children were loaded onto trains. They were taken to towns they had never seen. They were displayed on platforms and selected by farm families who needed labour or wanted children or both. The program was described by its founders as rescue, as opportunity, as the salvation of the urban poor. And maybe it was all of those things. I am not here to dispute the humanitarian framing entirely. But I want to ask a different set of questions about the orphan trains. Not about what they did for the children they carried, but about where those children came from. And specifically, about the category of child that the Children's Aid Society's own records describe with a consistency that I have not seen adequately examined anywhere in the mainstream literature on this subject. Because the intake records of the Children's Aid Society, the ones that were kept internally rather than published in the annual reports that went to donors and newspapers, describe a recurring category of child that does not fit the standard narrative of urban poverty and immigrant family breakdown that the official history of the program relies on. Children of unknown origin. Children with no documented parents, no documented birth location, no documented history prior to the moment they entered the intake system. Not orphaned, not abandoned in the sense of being left somewhere identifiable by someone traceable, simply present, in the system. Without an origin the record could point to, the Children's Aid Society's own internal correspondence uses a phrase that appears often enough to constitute a category: found children. Not foundlings in the traditional sense of infants left on doorsteps. Older children, children of 5, 7, 10, 12, children old enough to speak, old enough to have memories, old enough to describe where they had come from. And here is the part that the mainstream literature on the orphan trains has never examined with the attention it deserves. The intake workers' notes on what those children said about their origins. The notes exist. They are in archives. They are not secret in the sense of being classified or restricted. They are simply in the category of primary source material that does not get cited because what it contains does not fit the framework that the standard history of the period requires. What did the found children say about where they had come from? The descriptions cluster, not identically, not with the kind of uniformity that would suggest coaching or fabrication, but with enough consistency across different intake workers in different cities in different years that the pattern is visible once you are looking for it. They described buildings, large buildings. Buildings with specific architectural features that the intake workers, who were educated urban professionals familiar with the construction of their era, apparently found remarkable enough to note. Domed roofs, towers of unusual design, arched colonnades, interior spaces of a scale that the children struggled to convey in language appropriate to their age. They described communities, not cities in the sense the intake workers understood cities, something organized differently, something whose social structure the children described in terms that the intake workers translated into the closest available framework and noted as unusual. And they described an ending, not in those words, in the words available to children of 7 and 10 and 12, trying to describe something that had no name in the language they were being asked to use. A sudden cold, a darkness, a confusion that preceded the period they could clearly remember, and then the absence of everything that had come before. I want to be precise about what I am presenting here. I am not claiming that the intake notes of the Children's Aid Society constitute proof of anything. I am noting that a body of primary source material exists that describes a consistent pattern of testimony from a specific category of child in a specific historical window, and that this material has generated almost no serious academic attention despite being accessible in institutional archives. The absence of attention is itself something worth examining, because the 19th century was not an era indifferent to the testimony of children. The period produced extensive documentation of child witness accounts in legal proceedings, in social reform literature, in the emerging field of developmental psychology. The testimony of children was taken seriously enough to generate entire institutional frameworks around its collection and preservation. Except here, in this specific category. The found children and what they said about where they had come from. Here the documentation stops at the intake note and generates nothing downstream. No follow-up interviews, no institutional curiosity, no published case studies from the emerging psychological establishment that should have found the consistency of the testimony remarkable. The same silence. In a different archive, around a different category of evidence, producing the same shape. Now I want to talk about the industrial schools, because the orphan trains were one mechanism, but they were not the only one, and I think the industrial school system of the late 19th century is where the most significant part of this story is buried. The industrial school movement began in Britain in the 1840s and spread rapidly across the United States, Canada, and Australia in the following decades. The official purpose was education and vocational training for children who were categorized as at risk, children without stable family structures, children whose circumstances made them, in the language of the period, liable to fall into criminality or dependency without institutional intervention. The industrial schools were not prisons, they were not asylums. They occupied an institutional category specifically designed to be neither. They were schools. The children who entered them were students, and students, unlike asylum inmates, unlike prison populations, did not generate the kind of public accountability that might have produced inconvenient documentation. But the intake records of the industrial schools, in the archives where they have survived, contain the same category of admission that appears in the asylum records and the Children's Aid Society files. Children of unknown origin, children with no documented family history, children who could not be connected to any prior institutional record, despite being old enough that such records should have existed. And in the industrial school records, there is an additional category of notation that does not appear in the other systems: physical descriptions. Routine physical assessments conducted at intake and recorded in standardized forms that the schools used for health monitoring purposes. Those physical assessments, for the category of children I have been describing, contain measurements that fall outside the standard distribution in a specific direction. Not dramatically, not in the way that would have generated immediate attention or required the kind of institutional response that the asylum admissions described in the previous video required, but consistently, systematically. Height measurements in the upper range, bone density notations that the examining physicians flagged as unusual, descriptions of physical development that the standard pediatric framework of the period categorized as accelerated without being able to account for the acceleration. Children who were larger than they should have been, not impossibly large, not in the way that would have made them unmistakable, large enough to be noted, large enough that the physical assessment forms contain notations that cluster around a specific language, advanced for stated age, unusual skeletal development, physical presentation inconsistent with documented history. What does that mean? In the context of everything else this series has established, it means that the children of the old world, whatever their precise nature, whatever their relationship to the civilization we have been tracing, were not all the same. They were not all the scale that the asylum admissions described. Some of them were closer to the human range that the new civilization recognized as normal, close enough to pass, close enough to be processed through systems designed for ordinary children rather than systems designed for extraordinary adults. Close enough to disappear into the industrial school system and emerge years later with new names and new documented histories and no traceable connection to the origins they had described at intake. That is what I think the industrial schools were for. Not primarily, not in their stated purpose, but in the function they served for a specific category of child in a specific historical window. They were the mechanism by which the children of the old world were given new identities and released into the population of the new one. Documented, processed, renamed, released. And the testimony they had given at intake, the descriptions of the buildings and the communities and the sudden cold and the darkness, filed in a folder in an archive box that has not been opened in 140 years. And I want to stay with that folder for a moment, because there is something specific about the way institutional archives from this period are organized that I think matters to this investigation. The intake records of the industrial schools were not designed to be permanent. They were working documents, administrative tools. The information they contained was considered relevant only for the duration of the child's enrollment. Once the child graduated or was placed out or aged out of the system, the intake record was supposed to be superseded by the exit documentation, the new name, the new placement, the new documented history. In most cases, that is exactly what happened. The intake record was filed behind the exit record, and the exit record became the operative document. The origin the child had described at intake was replaced by the origin the institution had constructed, and the new origin was the one that followed the child into the population, into the census, into the marriage records, into the birth certificates of the next generation. This is how you replace a population's memory of itself. Not dramatically, not with a single moment of erasure, with paperwork. With the slow administrative replacement of one origin story with another, one folder at a time, one child at a time, across 2 decades of institutional processing that the public understood as charity and reform and the salvation of the unfortunate. The genius of it, if that is the right word, is that it required no conspiracy in the dramatic sense, no single coordinating authority issuing instructions, just institutions doing what institutions do, processing intake, generating documentation, filing records in the order that made administrative sense. And in doing so, across thousands of cases, in dozens of institutions across multiple countries, producing an outcome that no individual clerk and no individual school administrator would have recognized as the thing it was: the systematic replacement of a generation's origins. Now, I want to come to something that has been sitting with me since I first started pulling this thread, because there is a question that the evidence keeps circling without answering directly, and I think it is the most important question in this entire investigation. Why children specifically? Why was the institutional response to the survivors of the old world organized, at least in significant part, around children? Why not exclusively adults? Why not the asylum system alone? Why build an entirely separate infrastructure, the orphan trains, the industrial schools, the foundling hospitals, the reform institutions, specifically oriented toward the processing of children without documented origins? The answer I keep coming back to is memory. Adults who survived the catastrophe of the early 19th century carried memories that were formed, fixed. Adults who had lived inside the old world civilization carried a knowledge of it that was experiential and therefore resistant to replacement. You cannot give an adult a new origin story and expect the old one to dissolve. The old one is in the body, in the habits, in the way the person understands space and scale and the relationship between buildings and the people who inhabit them. Children are different. Children's memories are not fixed in the same way. Children's understanding of their own origins is constructed through the stories they are told about themselves as much as through direct experience. A child of 7 who is given a new name and a new history and is placed in the community that confirms that history at every point of contact will not necessarily hold on to the intake testimony as truth, will not necessarily know, by the time adulthood arrives, which memories are real and which were constructed for them by the institution that processed their origins. That is not speculation. That is basic developmental psychology. The 19th century did not have the terminology we use today, but the people running these institutions understood the principle. Charles Loring Brace wrote about it explicitly. The younger the child at placement, the more complete the assimilation. The more thoroughly the new origin replaced the old one, the less likely the adult that child became would ever look back at the intake record and recognize themselves in what it described. The children were processed because children could be made to forget, or more precisely, children could be made to remember differently, to carry the new story so completely that the old one became inaccessible even to them. And the intake records, the ones with the descriptions of the buildings and the darkness and the communities organized in ways the intake workers found remarkable, those records were not destroyed. That is the thing I keep coming back to. They were not burned. They were not systematically eliminated. They were filed, archived, preserved in the specific way that institutions preserve things they consider administratively closed, because destroying them would have required a decision. A specific institutional action that generated its own documentation. Destruction leaves traces. Filing leaves nothing but silence. So the records exist, in archives across the United States and Britain and Canada and Australia, in boxes that have not been opened in generations, filed behind the exit documentation that replaced them as the operative record, accessible in principle to any researcher with institutional access and enough patience to work through the administrative archaeology of 19th century child welfare systems, and generating, in the academic literature, almost no attention. I want to close with something that connects this directly to the larger architecture of what this series has been building. We've established across these investigations that the institutional response to the survivors of the old world was not random, it was systematic. It operated across different categories of institution, different nations, different decades, producing the same outcome with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence or parallel development. The bones went into one system, the adults went into another, the children went into a third. Each system was designed for the specific problem the category presented. The bones were physical evidence requiring physical containment. The adults were living witnesses requiring institutional isolation. The children were the future, the generation that, if left with their origins intact, might have carried the memory of the old world into the population of the new one, might have asked questions that the new civilization was not prepared to answer, might have looked at the architecture of the cities being built around them and recognized something in it, might have become, in other words, exactly the kind of inconvenient continuity that the entire apparatus of the reset was designed to prevent. So they were given new origins, new names, new histories constructed by institutions that understood at some level of their operation that what they were processing was not simply poverty and misfortune, was not simply the ordinary tragedy of children without families in a rapidly industrializing world, was something that required a more complete solution. And the solution was this: take the memory, replace it with documentation, release the child into the population as a new person, and file the old person in a box in an archive that no one will open for 150 years. That is what happened to the children of Tartaria. Not destruction, replacement. The most complete erasure available because it operated not on the physical record, but on the living memory of the people who carried it. Somewhere in those archives, the original testimony still exists. The descriptions of the buildings, the communities, the darkness that came before the world they were placed into, filed behind the exit records that replaced them, waiting in the specific way that suppressed evidence waits, not gone, just inaccessible, just buried under the documentation of the new world that was built on top of the old one. The next video goes somewhere this series has been building toward for a long time. I think you already know where. See you there.